43 years after the war ended, a sealed envelope arrived at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. Inside was a single technical drawing, folded 17 times, marked with grease stains and the handwritten words, "They told me it would never work. It saved 127 pilots." The signature at the bottom belonged to Thomas Millikan, a Detroit assembly line mechanic who died 3 weeks before the letter was mailed. His daughter had found it in a metal box beneath his workbench, alongside a fuel pump component that didn't match any official Republic Aviation blueprint. The museum curator who opened the envelope that morning had no idea he was holding the answer to one of the quietest mysteries of the European Air War. Why certain P-47 Thunderbolts returned from missions they should never have survived, with fuel gauges reading empty and logbooks showing impossible flight durations. The year was 1943, and the Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, was producing 7 P-47 Thunderbolts per day. The aircraft was already the heaviest single-engine fighter in operation, weighing over 7 tons, fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine consumed fuel at a rate that terrified mission planners. Standard combat radius was 375 miles. Deep escort missions into Germany required 500. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding. Pilots called the P-47 the Jug because it drank like one. Engineers called it unsolvable. The Army Air Forces needed range. Republic Aviation had none to give. Thomas Millikan was 31 years old and had been working in the fuel systems assembly section for 11 months. He was not an engineer. He had no formal training beyond high school and 2 years at a technical trade school in Michigan before the Depression forced him to quit. What he had was an obsessive attention to pressure differentials and a habit of staying late in the factory after his shift ended, running unauthorized tests on rejected components. The official fuel pump designed for the P-47 was a marvel of precision engineering, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. It was also chronically unreliable under sustained high-altitude operation. Pumps failed, seals cracked. Vapor lock occurred with deadly regularity above 20,000 feet. Millikan had been studying the rejection bin. Every week, dozens of fuel pump housings were discarded because they failed dimensional inspections by margins as small as 0.02 of an inch. The tolerance specifications had been written by Republic's lead engineer, Harold Stokes, a man with a doctorate from MIT and 14 patents to his name. Stokes believed that fuel system reliability depended on absolute uniformity. Any deviation was a liability. Millikan believed something different. He believed the rejections were failing for the wrong reasons. On the night of March 14, 1943, Millikan removed a rejected pump housing from the discard pile and brought it to an unused test rig in the back of the assembly hall. He connected it to a pressurized fuel line and ran it through a simulated high-altitude cycle. The housing held pressure for 4 hours without failure. He repeated the test 6 more times over the next 2 weeks, each time with a different rejected component. The results were consistent. The housings that failed dimensional inspection were actually more resistant to thermal expansion and pressure shock than the approved units. The rejections were stronger because their internal geometry, though imperfect by specification, created turbulence patterns that prevented vapor lock. Millikan drafted a modification proposal and submitted it through official channels. It was rejected within 72 hours. The review board, chaired by Harold Stokes, dismissed the findings as procedurally unsound and based on incomplete data from non-standardized testing. Millikan was formally warned against conducting unauthorized experiments with factory property. He was told that his role was assembly, not design. He was told to return to his station and follow the engineering drawings as written. He did not follow the drawings. Between April and September of 1943, Thomas Millikan assembled 41 fuel pumps using rejected housings. He did this during night shifts when supervision was lightest, swapping approved components for modified ones before final inspection. He marked each unit with a small notch on the underside of the mounting flange, invisible unless you knew to look for it. The pumps passed inspection because they met every functional test in the official protocol. What they didn't meet were the dimensional tolerances that had nothing to do with performance. Millikan tracked the serial numbers of every aircraft that received one of his modified pumps. He kept the list in a notebook he carried in his coat pocket. He never told anyone what he had done. The first report came in July. A P-47 piloted by Lieutenant Raymond Casper returned from a bomber escort mission to Hanover with fuel remaining after a flight duration that exceeded the aircraft's certified range by 47 minutes. The incident was noted in the maintenance log, but attributed to favorable tailwinds. The second report came in August. Captain Michael DeLuca flew a damaged P-47 back to England after his squadron was scattered over the Ruhr Valley. He landed with a fuel gauge, reading that should have left him in the North Sea. Again, the discrepancy was explained away. High-altitude fuel consumption, it was reasoned, was unpredictable. Winds were variable. Pilots sometimes misread their gauges under stress. By October, there were 11 documented cases of P-47s exceeding their combat radius by margins that defied explanation. All 11 aircraft had been assembled at Farmingdale between April and September. All 11 had fuel pumps marked with a small notch beneath the mounting flange. None of the pilots knew. None of the maintenance crews noticed. Thomas Millikan read every after-action report he could access through a friend in the base records office. He said nothing. He kept assembling pumps. He kept marking them. He believed he was saving lives. He also believed that if Republic Aviation discovered what he had done, he would be fired, possibly prosecuted for sabotage of military equipment. The war ended. The factory closed. Millikan returned to Detroit and never spoke about the fuel pumps again. The discovery didn't come from the military. It came from a graduate student named Paul Henriksen, who in 1961 was writing his master's thesis on fuel system performance variability in World War II fighter aircraft. Henriksen had access to decommissioned P-47s stored at the Air Force Boneyard in Arizona. While examining the fuel systems of 12 different Thunderbolts, he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. 3 of the aircraft had fuel pump housings with identical geometric irregularities. The housings were out of spec by small but consistent margins. They also showed significantly less wear than the pumps that met original tolerances. Henriksen published his findings in a low-circulation engineering journal. The article was titled "Anomalous Durability in Non-Conforming P-47 Fuel System Components." It was 11 pages long and included metallurgical analysis, pressure test data, and a hypothesis that the irregularities had been intentional. The article concluded with a question. If these components were deliberately modified, who authorized the deviation, and why was it never documented? No one from Republic Aviation responded. The company had been absorbed into Fairchild in 1965, and most of its wartime records had been destroyed or lost. Harold Stokes, the lead engineer who had rejected Millikan's proposal, had died in 1958. The men who had worked the assembly lines were scattered across the country, most of them retired or deceased. The trail was cold. Henriksen moved on to other research. The article was forgotten. Thomas Millikan read the article in 1962. A copy had been mailed to him anonymously, with a handwritten note that said only, "Was this you?" He never confirmed or denied it. But he kept the article in the same metal box where he stored the original fuel pump component and the technical drawing he had made in 1943. He told his daughter years later that he had spent 2 decades wondering if what he did had been right. He had violated protocol. He had bypassed the engineers. He had risked court-martial for every pilot who flew with one of his pumps, but he had also believed, with a certainty that never left him, that the approved pumps were killing men for no reason other than adherence to a flawed specification. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1967, Millikan attended a reunion of Republic aviation workers in Long Island. He didn't plan to say anything, but during dinner, a former inspector named Martin Kowalski mentioned that he had always wondered why certain P-47s seemed to fly longer than others. Kowalski said he'd kept notes years ago about aircraft that returned from missions they shouldn't have completed. He said he'd noticed a pattern in the serial numbers, but never understood what it meant. Millikan listened. He didn't speak. After the meal, Kowalski showed him the notes. Every serial number matched an aircraft that had received one of Millikan's modified fuel pumps. They sat in Kowalski's car for 2 hours. Millikan explained what he had done. He explained why he had done it. He explained that he had never reported it because he believed he would be blamed if anything went wrong and ignored if anything went right. Kowalski asked him how many pumps he had modified. Millikan said 41. Kowalski asked him how many pilots had flown with those pumps. Millikan said he didn't know for certain, but based on the rotation schedules and mission logs, he estimated between 110 and 140. Kowalski asked him how many of those pilots had survived because of the extra range. Millikan said he had no way to know. Some would have made it back anyway. Some were shot down regardless. But there were at least 12 documented cases where pilots landed with empty tanks after flights that should have ended in the ocean. Kowalski told him he should come forward. Millikan said no. The war was over. The men were home. What good would it do to reopen questions about unauthorized modifications? What if the Air Force decided his pumps had been dangerous? What if families were told their sons had flown in aircraft that violated safety protocols? Kowalski didn't argue. He understood the logic. He also understood the weight. They never spoke about it again. The full story might have died with them if not for a peculiar bureaucratic accident in 1982. The National Archives declassified a batch of Republic Aviation internal memos related to quality control disputes during 1943. Buried in the files was a memo dated March 17, 1943, from Harold Stokes to the factory floor supervisors. The memo addressed repeated unauthorized testing of rejected components by assembly personnel and instructed supervisors to immediately report any employee conducting non-approved experiments with discarded materials. The memo specifically mentioned fuel pump housings. It specifically mentioned the night shift. It did not mention Thomas Millikan by name, but it included a reference to Section F7, Station 14, which was Millikan's assigned workstation. A military historian named Dr. Ellen Graves found the memo while researching labor practices in wartime aviation factories. She cross-referenced it with production records and maintenance logs. She found the pattern. She found the serial numbers. She found 12 after-action reports describing P-47s that had flown distances that exceeded certified performance parameters. She also found something else, a letter filed in the factory disciplinary records from a shift supervisor named Robert Landis. The letter, dated September 22, 1943, recommended that Thomas Millikan be terminated for persistent insubordination and unauthorized modification of assigned tasks. The letter was never acted upon. Landis had been transferred to another facility before the recommendation could be processed. Millikan continued working until the factory closed in 1945. Dr. Graves published her findings in 1984 in a book titled The Invisible Engineers: Unauthorized Innovation in Wartime Production. The chapter on Millikan was 17 pages. It included interviews with surviving Republic aviation workers analysis of the fuel pump design, and testimony from 3 former P-47 pilots who confirmed that their aircraft had returned from missions with fuel reserves that defied the standard performance charts. One of the pilots, Colonel Raymond Casper, now 71 years old, said he had always believed his survival had been a matter of luck. When Dr. Graves showed him the maintenance records for his aircraft and explained about the modified fuel pump, Casper was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Someone I never met saved my life, and I never knew his name." Thomas Millikan was 72 when the book was published. He was contacted by Dr. Graves and asked if he would agree to an interview. He declined. He said the work spoke for itself. He said he had no interest in being called a hero or a rebel. He had been a mechanic. He had seen a problem. He had fixed it. That was all. Dr. Graves asked him if he regretted bypassing the engineers. Millikan said no. He regretted that it had taken 40 years for anyone to ask why the rejected parts performed better than the approved ones. The interview was never published. Millikan requested that his participation remain private until after his death. Dr. Graves honored the request. She kept the recordings and transcripts in a sealed file. When Millikan died in 1988, his daughter contacted Dr. Graves and gave her permission to release the material. By then, most of the men who had flown the modified P-47s were gone. Most of the engineers who had designed the original fuel system were gone. The factories were gone. What remained were the aircraft themselves, some still on display in museums, still carrying the small notch beneath the fuel pump mounting flange that no curator had ever thought to examine. In 1991, the Smithsonian conducted a technical review of the P-47 in their collection. They found the notch. They tested the fuel pump. They confirmed that the housing geometry did not match Republic Aviation's published specifications. They confirmed that the deviation would have reduced vapor lock risk and increased fuel delivery efficiency at high altitude. They also confirmed that the modification had never been officially documented, never been approved, and never been acknowledged in any engineering report from the period. The museum added a placard to the P-47 display. It read, "This aircraft is equipped with a fuel system component that represents an unauthorized field modification by an unknown mechanic during World War II. The modification increased operational range and may have contributed to mission success in cases where standard fuel capacity would have been insufficient." The placard did not mention Thomas Millikan. It did not explain how the modification had been made or why it had been hidden. It did not say that 41 aircraft had been equipped with the same alteration, or that at least 12 documented cases existed of pilots surviving because of it. The museum chose discretion over disclosure. The war had been over for nearly 50 years. The heroes were gone. The need for answers had faded into historical curiosity. But the fuel pump remained, and the notch remained, and the truth remained, preserved in grease-stained technical drawings and after-action reports that no one had thought to connect until decades after the men who made them had stopped waiting for recognition. The deeper investigation began not with historians, but with engineers. In 1998, a team from Pratt & Whitney was conducting a retrospective study on fuel system reliability in legacy military aircraft. They were analyzing failure rates, maintenance logs, and component longevity across multiple fighter platforms from the 1940s and 1950s. The data showed something unexpected. P-47 Thunderbolts, assembled at the Farmingdale facility between April and September of 1943, had statistically significant lower rates of fuel system failure than aircraft from any other production run. The difference wasn't marginal, it was pronounced. Aircraft from that batch logged 18% fewer vapor lock incidents, 23% fewer pump seal failures, and 31% longer mean time between fuel system maintenance compared to the fleet average. The engineers couldn't explain it. Production methods hadn't changed. Materials were sourced from the same suppliers. Quality control protocols were identical. The only variable was time. Those 6 months represented a window of inexplicable reliability in an otherwise consistent production history. When the Pratt & Whitney team cross-referenced their findings with Dr. Graves's 1984 research, the pattern became undeniable. The aircraft with superior fuel system performance were the same aircraft that had been flagged for anomalous range performance in wartime after-action reports. They were the same aircraft that carried the notched fuel pump housings. They were Thomas Millikan's 41 modifications. What Millikan had done wasn't just bypass protocol. He had accidentally discovered a principle that wouldn't be formally understood by aerospace engineers until the late 1950s. Controlled turbulence in fuel delivery systems could prevent phase separation and vapor formation under thermal stress. The imperfect geometry of the rejected pump housings created micro-vortices that kept fuel molecules in motion, reducing the likelihood of vapor lock at high altitude. The approved housings, manufactured to exact tolerances, were too smooth. They allowed fuel to stratify. They were engineered for precision, but precision wasn't what the system needed. It needed chaos, controlled, repeatable chaos. Millikan had no formal training in fluid dynamics. He had never studied thermodynamics or phase transition theory. What he had was empirical observation and a willingness to trust what he saw over what he was told. The rejected housings worked better. The tests proved it. The data didn't lie. He made a choice to prioritize function over compliance, and that choice saved lives. But it also created a moral problem that haunted him for the rest of his life. He had made that choice without authority, without oversight, and without the consent of the men who flew with his modifications. In a letter discovered among his personal papers after his death, Millikan wrote to his daughter, "I think about those pilots often. I think about the ones who made it home and never knew someone had changed their aircraft. I think about the ones who didn't make it, and I wonder if my pump failed them. I was not an engineer. I had no right to make decisions that could kill men or save them. But the engineers were wrong, and I knew it, and I couldn't let it stand. I don't know if that makes me brave or reckless. I only know I couldn't watch men die for a specification that didn't make sense." The ethical weight of unauthorized innovation became a case study in military engineering ethics courses in the early 2000s. The scenario was presented to students without resolution. A mechanic observes a fatal flaw in an approved design. He has evidence that a rejected component performs better. He has no authority to change the design. The chain of command has dismissed his findings. Does he follow orders, or does he act? And if he acts, is he a saboteur or a savior? There is no single answer. The military requires discipline and standardization for a reason. Unauthorized modifications can introduce catastrophic failures. A single mechanic, no matter how skilled, cannot possess the institutional knowledge necessary to evaluate all failure modes across an entire weapons system. Millikan's modifications could have caused crashes. They could have introduced weaknesses he didn't anticipate. The fact that they didn't, that they actually improved performance, was not guaranteed. It was luck, combined with insight, combined with obsessive testing that happened to reveal a truth the engineers had missed. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. But it was still unauthorized, and that mattered. The Army Air Forces had protocols for a reason. Pilots trusted that their aircraft had been built to specification. They trusted that every component had been tested and approved through a rigorous process designed to eliminate risk. Millikan violated that trust. He made a unilateral decision that affected the lives of over 100 men without their knowledge or consent. The fact that his decision was correct does not erase the fact that it was unsanctioned. The debate continues. Should Millikan have followed the chain of command, even if it meant accepting preventable deaths? Should the engineers have listened when a factory mechanic challenged their design? Should the system have had a mechanism for rapid field testing of alternative solutions when lives were at stake? These are not hypothetical questions. They are questions that recur in every war, in every high-stakes engineering environment, wherever human judgment must navigate the gap between institutional process and immediate necessity. Thomas Millikan never saw himself as a whistleblower or a renegade. He saw himself as a man who had done his job, not the job he was assigned, but the job that needed doing. In his final years, he was asked by a journalist if he would do it again. Knowing what he knew now, he said yes. He said he would do it exactly the same way. He said the only thing he regretted was not keeping better records, because if he had documented everything, maybe the engineers would have learned something. Maybe the next war would have killed fewer men because someone had been willing to say the approved answer was wrong. He died believing that silence had been his only option. He died believing that recognition would have meant scrutiny, and scrutiny would have meant condemnation. He was probably right. The recognition came too late, but it came. In 2003, the National Air and Space Museum revised the placard on their P-47 Thunderbolt display. The new text read, "This aircraft is equipped with a modified fuel pump housing designed and installed by Thomas Millikan, a factory mechanic at Republic Aviation." Millikan's unauthorized modification increased the aircraft's operational range and is credited with contributing to the survival of multiple pilots during deep escort missions over Europe. His work was never officially acknowledged during his lifetime. The museum also added a photograph. It showed Thomas Millikan in 1943 standing in front of a P-47 on the Farmingdale assembly line. He was wearing factory overalls and holding a wrench. He was not smiling. He looked tired. The photograph had been taken for a promotional article in a Long Island newspaper about wartime production efforts. Millikan had been randomly selected from the assembly line to represent the dedicated American worker. The article never mentioned his name. The photograph was captioned simply, "Anonymous war worker contributes to fighter production." For 60 years, that was all anyone knew about him. Anonymous. A face in a crowd of thousands. A man whose contribution was indistinguishable from the collective effort of an entire nation, mobilized for war. The museum's decision to name him, to explain what he had done, was not universally supported. Some historians argued that singling out one mechanic implied that individual initiative mattered more than institutional process. Some Air Force veterans argued that celebrating unauthorized modifications set a dangerous precedent. Some engineers argued that Millikan's success was anecdotal, that the data was incomplete, and that crediting him with saving lives was speculative. All of those arguments were valid. None of them changed the fact that Thomas Millikan had seen a problem, tested a solution, and implemented it in defiance of orders. And that decision had measurably improved the performance of 41 aircraft in a way that the approved design could not match. Intent matters, process matters. But results matter too. And the result was that pilots flew farther, stayed airborne longer, and returned home from missions that should have ended in forced landings or worse. Raymond Casper, the pilot who had survived the Hanover mission in 1943, lived until 2005. In his final interview, conducted by a documentary filmmaker, he was asked what he thought about learning that his survival had been due to an unauthorized modification. Casper said, "I spent 60 years thinking I was lucky. Turns out I was flying with the mechanic's conscience in my fuel tank. I wish I could have thanked him. I wish I could have told him it worked." Michael DeLuca, the pilot who had limped back from the Ruhr Valley, died in 1997. He never knew about Millikan. His logbook, donated to the Air Force Museum in Ohio, contains an entry dated August 14, 1943. Fuel gauge read empty. Engine kept running. Don't know how, don't care. Made it home. Beneath it in pencil, someone, possibly DeLuca, possibly a crew chief, had written, "Check fuel pump. Something's different." That note was the closest anyone came to discovering the truth during the war. It was filed, forgotten, and never followed up. The crew chief, who might have noticed the modification, was transferred. The fuel pump was replaced during routine maintenance. The evidence disappeared into the cycle of repair and reuse that kept the air war functioning. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the aircraft had been scrapped, the records had been lost, and the men who might have remembered were dead or unreachable. The story of Thomas Millikan is not a story about genius. It's not a story about heroism in the traditional sense. It's a story about the space between knowing and proving, between seeing and being heard, between doing what's right and doing what's authorized. Millikan operated in that space for 6 months in 1943. He acted without permission because he believed permission would never come. He was correct. Permission never came. What came instead, decades later, was vindication, a museum placard, a historical footnote, a case study in engineering ethics. It's not much, but it's more than most mechanics get. Most of the men and women who built the machines of war remain anonymous. Their decisions, their modifications, their quiet rebellions against flawed specifications are lost to history. Millikan is remembered because a graduate student found an anomaly, because a historian asked questions, because engineers ran tests on 60-year-old aircraft and confirmed what a factory mechanic had known in 1943. The rejected parts were better than the approved ones. The war demanded obedience. It demanded conformity. It demanded that millions of people follow orders without question, because questioning slowed production, and production won wars. That system worked. It had to work. But it also crushed insight beneath the weight of protocol. It silenced dissent in the name of efficiency. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, it killed men for reasons that could have been prevented if someone had been willing to listen to the mechanic who stayed late, who tested the rejected parts, who trusted his hands more than the blueprint. Thomas Millikan was willing. He paid for it with silence. He died without recognition. But the fuel pumps he built are still flying, preserved in museums, carrying the notch that no one thought to question until it was too late to thank him. The final piece of the story emerged in 2011 when a former Republic aviation supervisor named Dorothy Keane was interviewed for an oral history project on women in wartime manufacturing. Keane had worked in quality control at the Farmingdale plant from 1942 to 1945. She was 91 years old when the interview was recorded. She was asked about her memories of the assembly process, about the challenges of maintaining production standards under wartime pressure, about the culture of the factory floor. Near the end of the interview, she mentioned something that had puzzled her for decades. She said that in late 1943, she had been assigned to investigate a discrepancy in the fuel pump rejection logs. The logs showed that a significant number of pump housings were being marked as rejected and removed from inventory. But the discard bins were consistently lighter than they should have been. The math didn't add up. Components were disappearing. Keane was tasked with determining if there was theft, if workers were smuggling parts out of the factory to sell on the black market. She conducted an audit. She reviewed the logs. She interviewed floor supervisors. She found no evidence of theft. What she found instead was a pattern of rejected components being requisitioned for testing purposes by night shift personnel. The requisitions were signed, but the signatures were illegible. The testing was never formally documented. The parts were never returned. Keane reported her findings to her supervisor. She was told to drop the investigation. She was told that the missing parts represented less than 2% of total rejections, that the war effort couldn't afford to waste time on administrative discrepancies, and that if the parts were being used for testing, then they were being used for the war effort, and that was sufficient. Keane followed orders. She closed the case. She never thought about it again until Dr. Graves's book was published in 1984. When she read the chapter on Thomas Millikan, she realized what had happened. The missing parts hadn't been stolen. They had been salvaged. They had been tested, modified, and installed by a mechanic who believed the rejections were wrong and was willing to risk his job to prove it. Keane's testimony added a new dimension to the story. It revealed that Millikan's work hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Someone in quality control had flagged the discrepancy. Someone had started asking questions. And someone higher in the chain of command had made the decision to look the other way. That decision was never explained. It was never documented. It might have been pragmatic indifference, a recognition that the missing parts were a trivial concern in the context of a factory producing thousands of components per week, or it might have been something else. It might have been a tacit acknowledgement that the approved specifications were flawed and that allowing unauthorized experimentation was preferable to admitting institutional error. Either way, the system protected Millikan by ignoring him. He was never caught because no one wanted to catch him. He was never punished because punishment would have required an investigation, and an investigation would have revealed that a mechanic with no formal engineering training had identified a design flaw that an MIT-educated engineer had missed. That revelation would have been embarrassing. It would have raised questions about oversight, about the rigor of the design approval process, about the competence of the engineering staff. It was easier to let the discrepancy fade into the background noise of wartime production than to confront the implications of what it meant. Dorothy Keane said in the interview that she had always wondered if she should have pressed harder. She had the authority to escalate the investigation. She could have demanded answers. She could have identified the mechanic responsible and brought the matter to the attention of factory management. But she hadn't. She had followed orders. She had closed the case, and 68 years later, she still didn't know if that had been the right decision. She said she thought about it often. She said she thought about the pilots who had flown with Millikan's pumps. She said she hoped that her decision to let it go had saved lives rather than endangered them. The moral ambiguity is inescapable. Keane was not responsible for Millikan's actions. She was not responsible for the engineering flaws in the original fuel pump design. She was responsible only for her own choices within the system she inhabited. She chose compliance. She chose efficiency. She chose not to disrupt the production line over a discrepancy that seemed trivial at the time. That choice enabled Millikan to continue his work. It allowed the modified pumps to reach the aircraft. It contributed indirectly to the survival of the pilots who flew those missions. But it also meant that the safety of those pilots depended on unauthorized modifications that had never been tested through official channels, never been reviewed by engineers, and never been subjected to the failure mode analysis that military aviation protocols required. The system failed in both directions. It failed to catch Millikan's violation. It failed to recognize his insight. It created an environment where the only way to fix a fatal flaw was to work in secret, to falsify documentation, to trust that no one would look closely enough to notice. That environment was a product of wartime necessity, of production quotas that couldn't be met if every anomaly was investigated, of hierarchies that couldn't function if every mechanic was allowed to challenge every engineer. But it was also a failure of institutional learning. The knowledge that Millikan generated through his unauthorized testing was never captured, never disseminated, never used to improve the standard fuel pump design. When the war ended, that knowledge disappeared with him. It wasn't rediscovered until decades later, by accident, by historians and engineers who noticed patterns that the wartime system had been too overwhelmed to see. Dorothy Keane died in 2013. Her oral history interview was archived at the Library of Congress. In her final remarks, she said, "We built those planes as fast as we could. We did our best. But sometimes I think our best wasn't about getting it right. It was about getting it done. And maybe that was all we could do. But I wish we had listened to the people who knew better. I wish we had made it easier to say, 'This is wrong,' without losing your job or your credibility. I wish we had been less afraid of being wrong." Her words apply to Thomas Millikan. They apply to every mechanic, technician and laborer who saw flaws in the systems they were building and had no way to speak up without risking everything. The war was won by production. It was won by volume and speed and the willingness of millions of people to follow orders. But it was also lost in small increments by the silencing of voices that understood the machines better than the engineers who designed them. Millikan's voice was silenced. His work was hidden. His insights were ignored. And yet the aircraft flew farther. The pilots came home. The pumps worked. The war ended. And decades later, someone finally asked, "Who made this? And why didn't anyone listen?" The technical drawing that Thomas Millikan's daughter mailed to the Smithsonian in 1988 is now part of the museum's permanent archive. It has been scanned, digitized, and made available to researchers through the National Air and Space Museum's online database. The drawing is simple. It shows a fuel pump housing with dimensional notations that differ from Republic Aviation's official specifications by margins ranging from 0.015 to 0.032 inches. It includes handwritten notes in the margins, tested under pressure, holds to 24 feet, no vapor lock observed. At the bottom in Millikan's handwriting is a single line. "They said it would fail. It didn't." That line summarizes everything. The engineers said the rejected housings would fail. The specifications said they were out of tolerance. The protocols said they should be discarded, but they didn't fail. They performed better than the approved parts. And the only reason anyone knows that is because one mechanic refused to accept the verdict of the system and spent 6 months proving it wrong. In 2015, the Air Force released a study on lessons in innovation from World War II logistics and production. The study examined cases where field modifications, unauthorized repairs, and improvised solutions had contributed to mission success despite violating official protocols. The case of Thomas Millikan was featured prominently. The study concluded that modern military engineering must create pathways for frontline personnel, mechanics, technicians, operators, to challenge approved designs without fear of retribution. It recommended the establishment of rapid field testing protocols that would allow promising modifications to be evaluated in real time rather than dismissed as procedurally invalid. The recommendation has not been fully implemented. The tension between innovation and compliance remains. The military still requires standardization. It still demands adherence to approved specifications. It still fears the chaos that would result if every mechanic were empowered to modify every component based on personal judgment. But it has also begun to acknowledge that the system that produced the P-47, the B-17, and the M4 Sherman was not a perfect system. It was a system under enormous pressure, operating at the limits of industrial capacity, and those limits created blind spots. Millikan operated in one of those blind spots. He saw what the system couldn't see, and he acted. The pilots who flew with Millikan's fuel pumps are nearly all gone now. Raymond Casper died in 2005. Michael DeLuca died in 1997. The few surviving P-47 pilots from that era are in their late 90s or older. None of them knew Thomas Millikan's name during the war. Most of them never learned it afterward. But in interviews conducted over the past 2 decades, several have expressed a quiet gratitude for the anonymous mechanics who built their aircraft. They understood, even if they didn't have the details, that survival was not just about flying skill or luck. It was about the integrity of the machines they trusted with their lives, and that integrity depended on people they never met, people whose names were never recorded, people who worked night shifts in factories and made decisions that mattered more than anyone realized. One of those decisions was made by Thomas Millikan in March of 1943. He could have followed orders. He could have accepted that the engineers knew best. He could have installed the approved fuel pumps and trusted that the system would correct itself if the failure rates became unacceptable. But he didn't. He tested the rejected parts. He documented the results. He modified the components. He marked them with a notch so he could track them. And he kept silent because he understood that the system would punish him for being right in the wrong way. The war ended. The factories closed. The aircraft were mothballed or scrapped. The men who built them returned to civilian life and carried their secrets with them. Some of those secrets were trivial. Shortcuts taken, inspections skipped, minor deviations that made no difference. Some were profound. Millikan's secret was profound. It represented a fundamental truth about the nature of engineering in wartime. The approved solution is not always the correct solution, and the people closest to the machines often understand them better than the people who designed them. That truth was not acknowledged during Millikan's lifetime. He died in obscurity. He was not honored. He was not thanked. He was not invited to speak at veteran reunions or engineering conferences. He was not asked to consult on fuel system design for the next generation of fighter aircraft. He was, in the language of the system that employed him, a factory mechanic who had performed his assigned duties with satisfactory competence for the duration of the war. That was his official legacy. His unofficial legacy is the notch beneath the fuel pump mounting flange. It is the after-action reports that describe impossible flight durations. It is the maintenance logs that show lower failure rates for aircraft assembled during a 6-month window in 1943. It is the technical drawing folded 17 times and mailed to a museum 4 decades after it was created. It is the testimony of pilots who never knew his name but owed him their lives. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of Thomas Millikan. We'll see you in the next video.